no worries. We will be sending this to anyone who had registered, and it will also be available on our site, everbridge.com, under our resources tab within a few days. If you'd like to tweet at us, you can do so regarding this webinar at hashtag ActiveShooterPrep, hashtag Everbridge, or hashtag EBCommunity. And you can follow us on Twitter at Everbridge. So now I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker. Steve Cremando is a subject matter expert and trainer specialized in human factors, behavioral sciences, and homeland and corporate security, violence prevention and intervention, emergency and disaster management. He is a board-certified expert in traumatic stress and certified trauma specialist. He holds diplomatic status with the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress and the National Center for Crisis Management. He has been awarded Level 5 certification in Homeland Security. He is recognized as an expert in behavioral response to CBRN emergencies and mass violence. Steve is the Director of Training for the New Jersey Division of Mental Health Services Disaster and Terrorism Branch and consultant and trainer for the Federal Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration Disaster Technical Assistance Center. And now, with that, I would like to hand it over to our speaker, Steve. Steve, you may begin.
Thanks very much, and welcome aboard, everybody, as we get our slides going here. And I'll do a quick check and ask Michael if you can see my cover slide at this point.
Yes.
Very good. So let's get started. Again, everyone, thanks for joining us today. And you heard a little bit about my background. By training, I'm a behavioral scientist. I'm involved in a line of work that's referred to as operational psychology, which is the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical value. So that is what I discuss today. There'll be one slight exception, but in general, most of what I discuss doesn't have any real tie-in to mental health per se, but more specifically behavior about what people do and what they don't do in different sorts of crisis and emergency situations. And obviously today, we're speaking about one very specific sort of crisis, the active shooter sort of scenario. Now, I'm making some fundamental assumptions. The program today is not an active shooter 101 sort of course. It's, as I said, it's kind of based on the idea that you've got the fundamentals down. You probably have some good plans and policies in place. But as a foundation, before we go any further, I want to recommend a few documents to you. On your bookshelf, certainly we recommend anyone who's concerned with the active shooter situation to have these documents. The most current FBI study, published in 2014, you see here covering the 2000 to 2013 period. And the NYPD study, the first of its kind, published first in 2010 and then published again in 2012 after a very, very big year statistically of shootings. But specific to the campus environment, I want to make you aware of the guide from FEMA and related Homeland Security partners for developing emergency operations plans, and then the one very specifically about targeted violence that comes out of the FBI, the Justice Department, the Secret Service, and partners there as well. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind on your GoToWebinar chat? Do you mind selecting? For some reason, it didn't minimize. Do you mind moving? They can view it right now, the audience. Do you mind not the X button, obviously, but the one next to it on the top? Can you just select that to hide your GoToWebinar tab bar?
Sure. So did that work out?
It's still showing. Yeah, it's still showing.
Not on mine. It's not on mine. It's all the way tucked to the side. It's minimized on my screen, so I apologize for that.
Do you mind just going out of your slide for one? There we go. Perfect. All set. Thank you.
Okay, we're good. So, as I said, these 4 documents should be on the bookshelf if anyone is involved in planning for campuses or higher ed environments specific to active shooter situations. I'm going to talk a little more about some of the findings and some of the recommendations in these documents later on. Also, please remember, I know that I have a tendency to go a little bit quickly through this material, that Everbridge does archive all of these. Michael, I think that you'll give information at the end on how people can retrieve that, but I know you'll be able to go back and look at some of these documents, or the titles of them if you'd like to move forward and download them. Now, one of the things that those documents do is set forward a clear definition, and this is just our foundational work. We're going to get a lot more sophisticated than this in just a moment, but just that we're speaking about active shooters the same way. We're talking about a shooter who's looking for numbers. This is someone who has picked a target-rich environment, typically does not have a beef with any one or two individuals, so it's not a targeted violence in the very same way. We're going to make that distinction in a moment. When we look at these events, we know they have a very, very quick sort of evolution curve. The majority of these are over in 5 minutes or less, the new statistics. And I know there's competing statistics around the quickness of these events. 8 to 12 minutes is a number often cited. But in the FBI study, the most current FBI study, in those events where they could ascertain a timeline, just about 70% were over in 5 minutes or less. So this introduces the very, very important idea of the response gap, and that is the time between the first shots fired and our first incoming police and first responders. We know in a little more than half of those instances, when police arrive on the scene, the dynamic changes. The shooter goes from being the hunter to being the hunted, and in more than half of those instances, kills themselves as well. But we're talking about an active shooter of someone who's picked an environment for its targets, not necessarily picking specific individuals. Please notice the next to last point here. In the active shooter cases on record, we have another person shot about every 15 seconds. This ties back to our points later on in the program of why preparedness and why communication are so critical to us, because we'd like to deny the shooter their targets. We want to make sure we're moving quickly, we're communicating quickly, because these events evolve very, very fast, and because we know that another person is likely to be shot every 15 seconds. Now, this is different than a shooting incident. We've got a number of incidents that the media very quickly calls an active shooter. Sometimes we generically refer to as an active shooter. That in fact is not someone who is looking for numbers. They were looking for a very specific target or a very small target group. And yes, it's shots in progress, but it's a different sort of scenario. And that's important. That's from planning. It's important for us in terms of police response, as we'll talk about a little further on. But for our discussion today, we're talking active shooter. So we're going to talk about that situation that does have the potential to be a mass casualty event. Now, obviously, in an academic setting, this is a potential nightmare situation. We have had way too many of these around the country at colleges and universities. I don't have to review the cases. You are intimately aware of those. And at this point, sad to say, we're probably no longer really stunned or shocked when we hear about another case on the news. They become frequent enough that we become a little bit desensitized to the novelty of these. But we have to be very careful that we don't become in any way complacent to that as well. Colleges, of course, soft targets, wide open campuses, as much as we can secure our facilities. So many people moving each day in and out of our environments, target-rich environments. And then I want to make this last point. Other dynamics, such as the age of onset of serious mental illnesses, I'm going to speak about that in just a few moments. But for many of the major mental illnesses that do correlate with a slightly higher violence risk, major mood disorders, major thought disorders, the age of onset, particularly in males, is in that window of time that's roughly 16 years old to the early 20s. And very often this is a person, if there's a mental health component, who's now living away from home for the first time, their family is not seeing the changes the same way, but people on campus perhaps are concerned. And you've heard that story so many times as well. But I want to go in a slightly different direction as we start. And remember my orientation coming at this from a behavioral science standpoint, is we're going to start with a very basic concept, which is Lewin's equation. Dr. Kurt Lewin is thought to be the father of social psychology, and Lewin had said that human behavior is a function of both the person and the environment. Now, the active shooter environment is obviously a rarefied sort of environment to be in a shooting event. The closest thing that you and I could relate to that is either our firsthand knowledge or our expectations of what a combat environment would be like. You're thrust into a deadly force encounter, and you have to remember, folks, that the shooter always has the tactical advantage in the beginning of the situation. They have picked the time and the date, they've picked the location, and what we know about most active shooters of record is they've been involved in a pretty long and sophisticated planning curve in acquiring weapons and rehearsing their movements and really plotting this out. So they come very well prepared mentally and physically to this event. We are surprised, and we have to work to close that response gap to, again, tighten that to overcome the initial denial, the initial indecision and shock that we have, and sometimes that initial sort of freeze response that some people may have, because every second we waste in denial or indecision, that's got the potential of costing another life. So at the most basic level, you can assume, and we've seen this in videos and closed circuit television, and we hear this from survivors, you're talking about just an absolute hellish environment in which the level of noise, the level of fear and stress is going to make it very difficult for people to communicate, to move, to make decisions in the actual shooting environment. We know, depending on your facility, if it's an academic-style building, the construction of it, the hallways, and if it's an older or more historic sort of campus building, it may really amplify and it may move sound around. It makes it very difficult to know how many shooters we have, the direction the shooters are moving in, things of this nature. And we're going to go back to this in another few moments. What we just saw in JFK and LAX and some of the scares, active shooter scares over the past few weeks, there's the potential for almost a stampede sort of scenario at choke points, stairwells, escalators, things of that nature, as well as people try to flee. You have the potential for very irrational, illogical flight behavior. And you do, from a planning standpoint, actually have to anticipate injuries from that. You are likely to have other injuries of folks, not from the weapon, but people who actually were hurt in their attempt to flee the perceived risk. As you can imagine, extreme stress response, the thing you have to think about is fine motor skills deteriorate, problem solving diminishes, people tend to go on autopilot. And this speaks to us about something very important. If you're not familiar with this expression, please hold on to this phrase. When we are thrust into a crisis, we do not rise to the occasion. We fall to our training. So we see this over and over, whether it's first responders or civilians. If we are drilling into people's heads certain behaviors, if we're rehearsing that, if we're practicing it that way, they're likely to fall to that level of training during the crisis. So it's very important, awareness standpoint and from a drill and exercise standpoint, to get this right. The other thing to notice on the top half of this slide, when we look at this from a science standpoint, that stress response, it affects all of us, even the incoming law enforcement professionals and otherwise. People are going to be very, very amped up. It is at a very, very primal level. We talk about our fight-flight response and the whole neurochemistry of that as well, that people are going to be behaving quite differently and not necessarily making their best decisions. So we have to make this as simple as possible. We have to ensure decision-making and communications are as streamlined as possible. So for our presentation today, what we're going to do is move quickly through 4 areas of evolution. As I said, this is not an active shooter 101 course. We're assuming you have a good foundation of knowledge and preparedness about this, and we're going to introduce some things that are new, some things that your organization actually has to start thinking about now. And one of the first things, as I mentioned in this last slide, is the transition beyond run, hide, fight, the transition to what we're referring to as active shooter 2.0. and these three core elements. And I'm going to tie our presentation back to these elements throughout the remainder of our session. Stop the killing, stop the dying, and stop the crying. And you'll understand what I mean by stop the crying and its tactical value. So again, we're not talking about crisis counseling and grief counseling and trauma counseling that may be very necessary after, the shooter's down and the situation's resolved. But we're going to talk about 0-hour behavioral management right in the crisis itself. What will we do to address some of the behavioral reactions there as well? I'm not going to belabor this slide, folks. Obviously, we can pick up the newspaper and with unfortunate and uncomfortable frequency see another shooting event at a school or college environment. And the numbers of those killed, the numbers of those injured have increased with the frequency of the events themselves. Probably 5 years ago, we were averaging something on the order of 5 to 6 of these events a year. We're out at a little more than 15 major shooting events now per year. And sadly, we've become in this place where we always know there's another one in the pipeline. So these are not questions anymore of if there'll be another shooting. Really, it's where and when will that be and how ready will any of us be. Please notice from the NYPD study, these were landmark studies looking at big data sets. In the New York City study, 324 active shooter cases studied from the first one, the Texas Bell Tower shooter, kind of the first active shooter of record, up through the Newtown, Connecticut shooting and a little bit beyond. Please notice that just short of a quarter of those scenarios in which they were college-related, that there's an academic relationship. So it's a campus sort of shooting, student to student, but we've had student to faculty and we've had faculty to faculty. They're all part of that mix. And you do need to think of that beyond just the student as the shooter. As we look at data up through 2015, you see a trend, obviously a spike in some years of the number of events, of the number of people injured, and number of people killed. The data does nothing other than really reinforce for us that there's an urgency for us to be planning this. And sometimes if you get pushback from anyone in your organization, the data can be helpful in really demonstrating that this is a problem that A, is not going away, and B, in some ways seems to be getting worse. When we look specifically at those active shooter events in higher ed, a few things jump out at us. First of all, educational environments were about the middle of the pack in terms of different environments. They were 5th highest of the 11 categories rated. What you notice, though, is in most of these events, you don't end up with big numbers of killed. So those that were on the order of a Virginia Tech and otherwise are a little bit of a statistical outlier. So they tend to be smaller victim numbers. But you see some in the statistics here, without me reading the slides, that the vast majority of the shooters are male. The most common scenario is a student or a former student and so forth. And in most instances, the shooter either kills himself or is killed by police. But I want to talk about motive because this is unique to college. It's a little beyond just the simple statistics. If you're not familiar with this concept, it's an interesting concept. It's referred to as the Herostratus complex. Now I'm going to jump back and forth between slides for a moment. Herostratus was actually an arsonist in ancient Greece. He had burned down a very famous temple. Temple of Aramis there was one of the 7 wonders of the world in 356 BC. When he was apprehended by the authorities of the day, and they asked him, what in the world were you doing? What were you thinking? He essentially said, no one was ever going to know me, and now my name will live on forever. I will be famous forever. So the Herostratus complex is that person very often, and we see this in college and high school age males as a fairly frequent motivator, the person who felt some way that this will bring them notoriety, it will bring them fame or infamy, that they will be blasted all over the media. That's true, and very often discussions now of should we use the shooter's name, should we use the shooter's photograph, hinge around this idea that we don't necessarily want to feed the infamy. I think that's different. I got to give you my perspective when we're having a professional conversation like this. where we get to know the shooters, we get to think about them as people and their behavior. I think that's different than broadcasting it on the news. So there's some discussion about that. But I want to point out one thing that's interesting in this issue of Herostratus complex, which is very often when you hear about a shooter, especially a campus shooter, the next thing you hear is, oh, that guy was a loner, kept to himself, he didn't speak to other people. The thing I'd like you to hold on to is it's not a question of if you're a loner, the question is why are you alone? And if why are you alone is because of this idea that you may be an incompetent joiner. You want to sit at the cool lunch table. You want to hang out with that club or frat. You want to be on the team or get that date, and you're just a little bit socially awkward. You have a tough time breaking in, and you get pushed away, and you leave angry and hurt. That is a different dynamic. So it's not simply being alone, because for some of you on this call right now, being alone might be like your happy place. Man, you wish you had more alone time. And being alone doesn't raise your risk of violence, it probably decreases it. So it's not really just being a loner. It's really, as you look at our behavioral analysis teams on campus or our threat assessment teams on campus, this idea of the incompetent joiner. And that's one of the motivators. And you also saw suicide, feeling bullied, other common sort of motivators of people in the college, university age group. When we look at shooters, 2 of the 3 here, we see Jared Loeffner, James Holmes, our Aurora, Colorado shooter, and Adam Lanza. 2 of the 3 were in school and had been put out of their classes because their behavior seemed disturbed or distressed or it was disruptive to the school. Jared Loeffner, our shooter of Congress from Giffords, James Holmes in the center here, our shooter in Aurora, Colorado, Adam Lanza to the far right, our shooter in Newtown, Connecticut, again, all in the same age bracket. Now, this brings me to that point about age of onset. Now, I just want to be clear, because I don't want to cast this kind of wide net that misrepresents individuals who may be struggling with a mental illness as being necessarily more violent. In fact, what the research in this area tells us, and it has told us this for decades, is that someone with a mental illness is no more likely to be violent than the average individual, except under different circumstances. I'll give you some examples, like noncompliance with medication or becoming involved with substance abuse. Those combined with mental illness, those will raise the risk. But my point there, and something very interesting when we go back even one slide to our kind of mugshots of these well-known shooters, is the age of onset. All these individuals were struggling with mental health issues. They were known by their communities to have these issues. They were involved or they were recommended to treatment. As I said to you earlier, this is a very narrow slice of life, the college years. Now, I understand I'm generalizing, because on our college campuses, you can have students who are well into their lifespan, and you can have sometimes students who are a bit younger. But the classic sort of, if there is a classic sort of college age of being between perhaps 17 or 18 into the early 20s, this is also the age of onset for many of the major mental health conditions. So when we think back to that expression before about behavior as a function of the person and the environment, this person who comes into our campus environment, into this one time frame, with different stresses, different challenges, may all be contributing factors towards the violence potential. I wanted to move on now and introduce this concept. If you're not familiar, many of you will be familiar with OSHA's 4 types of workplace violence. For example, type 1, the stranger; type 2, patient or customer or client; type 3, the coworker; type 4, domestic violence. If you're not familiar, certainly applicable to our current environment, type 5 is ideological violence. It's the person who targets your campus or your organization, not looking for any one individual, not who has a chip on their shoulder about feeling wronged personally, but because of what you do or what you represent, even simply representing a soft target with a target-rich sort of landscape. Colorado Springs, the Planned Parenthood shooting. Very first day in court, the shooter gets up and his first statement is, "I'm a warrior for the babies." And he very clearly articulates his ideology and how he sees his perception that his violence was justified. Shooting, targeting, or recruiting centers for armed services, those kind of things, again, and think about ROTC on campus, those targets sometimes are selected for ideological reasons. And that starts to sound like terrorism, doesn't it? So type 5 violence is actually kind of the intersection of where classic kind of workplace violence ideas and models and our current terrorism sort of perspective, they all sort of collide, and something can simultaneously fit that profile. Now, as I said, today's an update. It's new thinking. It's going beyond where you've been. And we've had events. I think the last time perhaps that I gave this presentation as a webinar was pre-Orlando. And of one thing, very significant change that you should be aware of that comes out of Orlando. It's going to drive our discussion later of how we look at run, hide, fight a little bit differently. But I wanted to raise your awareness, many of you would know this, that very quickly on the heels of the Orlando nightclub shooting, Al-Qaeda, who publishes a pretty glossy online magazine, as does ISIS, published a very special 4-page guide summarizing the activity of the Orlando shooter. And like you'd imagine, they praised the shooter. He was a martyr and a wonderful champion, and everyone should go do what he did. But this is what I'd like, a few very interesting quotes. One, this idea of the public combatant is that the call is out to target for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, regardless of which organization you affiliate yourself with, that's no longer important, is to attack the general population in America. So in the first bullet point, you see my line underlined. This means we, the jihadists, no longer view folks as civilians. Everyone is a potential combatant. Go for it. They are calling on others to wage similar operations to target general gatherings. I want you to think about your campus environment, about big events you may have on campus, and are they then more attractive targets of a terrorist or shooter because of this call to action by these leading terrorist organizations, who obviously are doing a great job in recruitment and radicalization of people online. A few other ideas that come out of this, if you're not familiar, the emerging idea of hybrid targeted violence. Hybrid targeted violence, we saw this in the San Bernardino case, we saw this in Paris and Belgium, we saw it in a number of places over the past few years, simultaneously using different sorts of weapons, primarily firearms and improvised explosive devices, but not necessarily limited to that, and lastly, the idea of hitting several targets simultaneously. So as I said, what we've seen in Europe was a more willingness to use this sort of model. It is not brand new. We saw this in the Westgate Mall in Nairobi. We saw this in Paris. And there were elements of this in the Boston Marathon bombing and then in San Bernardino as well. The idea here, I think I quoted it, actually the citation here, if you do want to go to the article. Remember, you can go back to the archive and look at these slides. This is not my concept, but one that's emerging in the Homeland Security environment. The other thing you should know about hybrid targeted violence, we're talking about well-trained, tactically sophisticated sort of attackers, usually multiple attackers, whether it was the husband and wife team in San Bernardino. They're coming dressed for the game, so in full tactical gear, ballistic gear, and so forth, and usually coming with multiple lines of attack. As we saw, the device that was left at the Inland Regional Center wired in California, San Bernardino, to a remote control car that was intended to be detonated as a secondary device for the incoming responders. So what you're seeing is the nature of shooting events is evolving. We can't take out of the equation the events that we've seen. We need to keep learning from those. But you're seeing into the mix a different sort of threat, and that's the one of a more terrorist sort of motive coming to campus. So I wanted to introduce you to those ideas of hybrid targeted violence, of type 5 violence, and some of what's going on in intelligence community in terms of what we're seeing as being promoted to the would-be attacker. Now, all of this in the evolution, it continues to change how police and EMS respond. Some of your organizations, if you're higher ed, you may have your own EMS on campus. You may be a smaller campus and have a reliance on the community EMS. But the nature of thinking about police response and EMS response is changing. And I want to bring you up to speed with that as well. Very, very quickly as an overview, pre-Columbine, contain and wait. And we saw this in Columbine. The first incoming police formed the perimeter. No one comes in, no one comes out. We waited for special teams. The first police didn't go into that building for 47 minutes into the scenario. And obviously we had people who were lost and more people who were shot because of that sort of delay. And everyone kind of reconsidered that fairly immediately after Columbine. The next gen, and these build on each other, these are not necessarily eliminated. The next generation were teams and formations where the arriving officers would wait for potentially a team of 4 or 5. They would, squad up into different formations as an entry team or a hunter cell, move in a certain way towards the sound of shots. And that was very effective, was very helpful. But when we get to something like Newtown, we reconsider again. And where we are at the moment is 2 different things going on. One is the idea of solo entry, either 1 officer or 2 officer entering the live fire environment, or what we're going to talk about in a moment, MACTAC. Now, please notice the last point here. An FBI report, February of 2013, clearly said to us, 1 out of every 3 officers who goes into a shooting environment alone is likely to get shot themselves. So this is a very, very high-risk endeavor. But obviously going in with that idea of the response gap, the quicker we make contact with the shooter, the more likely the shooters either to end this themselves or we could potentially end this from a police standpoint. So we have the possibility now of solo entry, which really was not considered in the former generations. And then, as I said, MACTAC. MACTAC is the response to that hybrid targeted violence scenario, where we may have multiple attackers at multiple locations using different sorts of modes of attack, as I said, IED as well as firearms and such. These are all models that law enforcement still have in the toolkit. If you're doing exercising, coordination, planning with your either on-campus or community police departments, I want you to know where their heads are at. I want you to continue your liaison. I'd certainly suggest planning and exercising with them as well, because these are very complex sorts of responses, and they're happening in the highest stress environment you can think about, with really every second counting as we respond. But the role of EMS has changed as well. If you're not familiar, the term that's being used here is called Rescue Task Force. Rescue Task Force is the idea that we're going to gear up smaller teams of EMS personnel in ballistic sort of equipment, vests and helmets primarily, to go in under the cover of 2 tactical officers into the warm zone, not into the hot zone. So these EMS personnel would not be carrying weapons. This is not the kind of dock with a Glock situation that we've heard about after San Bernardino. These are either campus or community EMS responders who have been selected, trained, and outfitted to operate in that warm zone, because we know the single greatest risk to victims is bleeding out. So we want to get to them pretty quickly. And now this starts to allow us to go into that. Please notice on my slides in the upper right column this reference to the Hartford Consensus. If you'd like more information about this movement towards a tactical EMS standpoint and having EMS operate in warm zone, go out and just do a search for the Hartford Consensus. This will talk to you about the American College of Surgeons' position and recommendations for our national EMS capabilities to start ramping up and looking at incorporating this into their methods of response as well. As I said, case by case, sadly, we are learning important lessons. A lot of the lessons that drive this actually come out of Iraq and Afghanistan, out of our combat environments, of what was combat emergency casualty care is now really becoming more civilianized. I'm going to talk to you about just how civilianized that's becoming in a moment. but obviously this requires special training, special equipment. But it just means that our first responders, our EMS responders, are getting hands-on much more quickly and stopping that bleeding out sort of scenario. Just again, lessons learned over the last 3 weeks. Many of you had seen on the news, maybe even someone on this call had been there for these events, the scares at JFK and LAX of a shooter and the frantic sort of behavior that happened and people trying to evacuate. Now, we saw something comparable to this in the first LAX shooting a few years ago when that individual had targeted TSA officers. But I wanted to mention this because it's very interesting. As planners and decision makers, very often we look at crowd management issues as, when we have a big event, whether it's a sporting event, a concert, or even civil unrest on campus, and we think about it as a separate sort of emergency as an active shooter emergency. And as I said earlier, the stampede to get out, which we've known about, we've seen this in many, especially in shopping mall scenarios, we know poses a real threat to people in that environment as well. So a recommendation for you is, as you're training people to run, hide, fight, it's important to remember that some of the environments they may be running from, how they run and where they run to, may actually be putting them at greater risk. So we want you to understand a few things about that and think about, is it worth building any crowd safety discussion into your active shooter plans as well? Now, the thing that drives this, of course, is panic. Panic, as we know in emergency management, is actually not likely in most emergency situations. Yeah, extreme fear and stress and anxiety are, but not true panic. Please notice that first, panic is based on a perception of limited opportunity for escape or limited availability to critical supplies. And obviously in a shots fired situation, or even rumor of a shots fired situation, you get the first of those sort of scenarios, perception of limited opportunity for escape. Now, I want to bring up this case. Some of you will be familiar. It was August 2005, a bridge in Baghdad during a huge religious pilgrimage. And literally tens of thousands of religious pilgrims are moving through Baghdad, crossing a bridge, this major choke point. And someone on the bridge yells out, they see wires hanging from someone's backpack, and they yell out, there's a suicide bomber on the bridge. In the stampede to get off the bridge, 965 people were killed. Guess what? No bomber. So, I very often say in other sorts of disaster training, you got to remember disasters can create crowds, but we also have to remember that crowds can create disasters. And here we have a mass casualty event caused purely by human behavior and purely by panic. So as you're looking at your environments, and you're looking at planning, and you're looking also at training, understand these ideas that we can get what is referred to as an escape mob in response to a shot fired or rumor. And there's probably some things we want to share with our population, our student population, our guests, our visitors, which is essentially the very basics. I'm going to do this very quickly because it's not the center of focus of today, but I want you to just have some real down and dirty crowd safety ideas to share with people. In general, if you see a crowd surging, as we just saw in the airports, try to stay to the outside of the crowds. The deeper we go into the crowd, the more our risk changes. Try to stay away from immovable surfaces, walls, doors, and such, because the crowd shifts direction. We could end up in a crowd crush situation, and we could be pinned against an immovable object. People should know you keep moving with the crowd until you can get out of it. Don't sit down, don't stand still, because the crowd's not stopping for you. And even if you drop something, unless it's absolutely critical, let it go, because going low to the ground to pick it up may get you plowed under. If you're being pushed or pulled by a crowd, try to stay with the flow, and like we would do, for those of you who are familiar with swimming at the ocean, if you're caught in a riptide, you slowly, again, work parallel to the beach. You don't fight the tide pulling you out. You don't let it take you out. You go parallel across it. Well, in a crowd, you go diagonally till you get out to the fringes, out to the sides of the crowd where the forces become weaker. But you try to get out of the center part of it as quickly as possible. So there's some very basic things to know. As I said, if you fall down, try to get on our feet as quickly as possible. If you can't, try to reach out and have people pull us up. If you can't get to your feet, keep moving even if you have to crawl. And if you can't crawl, Just duck and cover, protect your airways, protect vital areas until you feel a little lull in the crowd and you can get back to your feet. Now that does not sound like traditional active shooter discussion, right? That's crowd safety stuff. But you have to remember, as I said, disasters and emergencies can cause crowds and sudden, very sudden spontaneous crowds that actually represent a bigger risk than the shooter because he may be out of the equation or it could have been just a rumor. So I want to move on to now where we are with some thinking about our organizational response. And then, as I said, we're going to have time for some questions and answers later. Active Shooter 2.0, from our perspective, is moving simply beyond where we were a few years ago, with such a focus in the narrow time frame from shots fired to shooter down. All our focus was what are we doing, run, hide, fight in those moments of terror. Obviously, you need to be thinking long before and long after about the overall timeline of this event, but I want you to think about what's going on in the event besides just a shooter that creates some opportunities for you that actually increase survival. First of all, run, hide, fight is meant for stopping the killing. And yes, everyone should have a basic idea of that. But please understand, when you look at active shooter, it's one of the very, very few sorts of crimes that law enforcement actually looks at, potential victims and survivors as initial first responders. Not necessarily in a classic, first aid sense, but someone who could influence the outcome of the situation. Which means as you're thinking about your campus and all the people we provide discussion and training about active shooter, are we giving them the right message and are we giving them the right skills? Now, I am just raising some ideas with these next several slides, some things you could think about. And the very first of these is we have been indoctrinated in this idea, and this comes from the initial Homeland Security model of run, hide, fight, that fight should always be the last resort. So the message was run if you can, hide if you can't, and fight if you must. But fight should always be last. And then we come into a situation, as we had in Orlando, where you have 300 people in the nightclub and one shooter. And what did people do when those shots are fired? They ran. Good move. Where did they run to? They ran to the restrooms where they could hide. And who followed them into the restroom? Yeah, it's the shooter. And these folks were trapped, and it becomes a massacre. In a club with 300 people and one shooter who obviously has to stop occasionally to reload, was there an occasion, and I'm not second-guessing people, but could there have been an occasion for 3 people, 10 people, 30 people to jump that guy and stop it? Should fight have been earlier? Should fight have been the initial response? Now, I wasn't in that environment. You were not in that environment. None of us could ultimately know. But in the second graphic, what this causes is a potential change in the discussion that run, hide, and fight perhaps should be independent options and not be taught in a linear or sequential way. That maybe we shouldn't be teaching, first we run, then we hide, and then we fight, but fight only as a last resort. Maybe fight in some circumstances using an instrument and looking at the totality of the circumstances. Maybe fight's actually the best first response. I, again, and you, unless we're actually in that moment of terror, are hard-pressed to make a judgment about what people should do. But we have to be careful how we teach people. If we go back to this idea that we fall to our training, we don't rise to the occasion. If we have taught them, think about fight last after you've exhausted every other option, we might actually be painting people in the corner. So we need to think about that. Now, there's very good research, and this is some of the research done by Blair at the University of Texas that looks at bystander intervention. And if you look at the line at the center of that graphic, that's the line where the police arrived. So this was looking at 83 cases in the smaller study. And what you saw is on the left side of the graph, before police arrived, that's 40 cases. In 16 of the 40, which is roughly about 40%, the shooting was stopped by bystander intervention. So the question really, can bystanders successfully stop an armed shooter? The answer is, and we know this, and we have a lot of good anecdotal evidence as well, they can and they do. But we have to give them the right kind of training and tell them, what does fight mean? Well, fight means essentially distract, disrupt, or disarm. because even if you're distracting this person, who we have seen is in the zone, they are so focused, so methodical, so cold-blooded in their killing, that even if we distract them for that few seconds, break their rhythm, this potentially saves another few lives. So we do want to teach people, what do we mean by fight? That's important to us. Something like, push a weapon down into the side, not straight up or down, not to the side where other people can get hurt. Stopping the dying is a new entry here. If you're not familiar, Homeland Security has just begun a fairly new national campaign that is called Stop the Bleed. It's based on this idea that most people who die in active shooter situations, they die, as I said, by bleeding out. So the old school was, wait till we could bring people out to a casualty collection point, or wait till law enforcement was sufficiently cleared and made safety environment that we could bring EMS in. But you know and I know that law enforcement's been trained to walk right past those wounded and focus on finding and stopping the shooter. And if we're delaying hands-on hemorrhage control, we're going to lose people. So without going into great detail about the medical realities, as I say, this is actually the most common and the most preventable aspect of people dying in active shooter situations is bleeding out. Please take a look. Go to Homeland Security, just dhs.gov, search with their engine, Stop the Bleed. Great resources, training videos, some good things for you to share with people. This is now how we train civilians. This isn't training for EMS. This is training for anyone who finds himself in an environment in which bleeding control, what we call BCON, really becomes a necessary skill set. And what you've seen some organizations do is start to move towards putting up wall kits or throws that have the very basic tourniquets, combat gauze, materials that anyone can pick up and use, even without any prior training in this level of first aid. So we understand that civilians are going to be in the mix. We understand they may be the only people in the initial kind of attack, and it may be a while before help actually gets to that wounded person. Can we leverage that? Now, kind of closing out my stopping the crying phase. Stopping the crying, as I said, is not to say people shouldn't grieve, they shouldn't be upset, they shouldn't be completely emotionally overwhelmed by this event. But if you've seen the Run, Hide, Fight video by the Houston Mayor's office, you may remember this woman in the graphic here who is losing it. And people often ask me, what do we do with her? And what we do with someone like that is psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is a skill set in the 0 to 48 hours of the incident, 0 hours, I said. It's in every person's skill set, just as we can train people in basic hands-on first aid. But this is different. Please take a look at the slide. It's different than mental health first aid training, which we're assuming the person is having a mental health crisis, an underlying psychiatric issue. This does not assume any level of mental illness. This is just assuming the person is completely blown away by the situation. So good training, when we think about who's in the environment, how we leverage them, how we start continuing to apply the learning from each case we go through to enhancing our capabilities. And of course, one of the most critical things is just rapid and accurate communication, because the very best thing to do is deny the shooter their targets by having people know where the threat is, where they're moving, what they should do. So a lot of this is based on the idea of templating your communications. We know the response curve is going to be so steep. We know that the event is going to unfold so quickly that it's not going to leave you a lot of time to really formulate, new messaging and a lot of new communication. So your tools need to be sharp. You need to have your mass notification tools up to snuff, practiced, exercised, and pre-loaded. You need to have those messages, your wording thought through, how we communicate core actions to people. Folks need to know what's happening, where it's happening, what they're recommended to do, and what, how they will hear next about what their next action is. If it's an all clear or a moving to a different location. So just knowing that these events are driven by fear and driven by the clock, the second hand on the clock. really speaks to the importance of your notification tools, of your messaging, and your rehearsal of deploying those messages in plain language, no longer using codes. The recommendation from the authorities is really make sure we're speaking in plain language that everyone can understand. Get message out to people quickly, let them know those key bullet points, and do it in redundant ways so everyone gets that. I'm going to jump ahead. As I said, you heard my presentation. I'll leave time for a few points from Everbridge and a few points, maybe a few question and answers. I'm thinking, given what we're seeing, we should understand how the terrorist risk is changing and may apply to us more on campus. Think about the crowd safety ideas I interjected. The importance of bystander intervention, which now also includes hands-on bleeding control and site first aid. And that's what I have to share today on top of this last quote from Emerson, who said, when skating on thin ice, our safety is in our speed. That's what the rapid communication is about, and I know that's what Michael's going to speak to us about now for a few moments.
Thank you, Steve. And as I'm setting up, switching over to my slides, just as a reminder, because I saw a couple of these questions come in, you will be able to get a copy of these slides. We'll send them out at the end of the webinar. So just, we'll send them to your email within a day or so. So just keep an eye out for that. And let's stop.
If you want, Michael, I can advance your slides if it helps.
I got it now. Thank you.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
So I'm going to quickly walk through how Everbridge can be applied in these situations, and thank you, Steve, for going through some great background best practices and research that has been done on the subject. And now I'd just like to talk to you guys about how Everbridge applies to these situations. So there's really three critical communication channels during these type of incidents. You know, the first off is the responders, the emergency responders, the people who are going to be acting on and going in to, you know, stop the active shooter and also help save the people who have been affected or need to escape. Second is you need to alert, you know, the people who could be potentially affected, so the impacted constituents. And third is notify, you know, command executives, key stakeholders who are going to need to, you know, contact the media, contact school officials, law enforcement, etc. So let's talk about the Everbridge communication, critical communication solution. So first off, with Everbridge, you can create predefined templates and determine the what. You know, what you're going to be alerting, whether it's a missing person incident, a fire, medical, or, as we've been discussing today, an active shooter scenario. From there, you can predetermine who's going to get this message and also add this on the fly. So do you need the responders? Do you also need someone who's on call? You know, who are the stakeholders you need to message? And you can also determine the students and faculty you need to message, and visitors in some situations. Also, an important thing is the how. How are you going to reach them? So Everbridge allows you to add in multiple contact paths. Everybody obviously likes to receive messages in different ways. We have a large variety of communication channels that we use on a daily basis and contact paths, whether it be, you know, an email to our work email via our work laptop, or you know, a personal call to our personal line, or a text message. And then how do you want to collaborate? So this is obviously for both ends of the spectrum, you know, the responders and the people who, your students or faculty who might be affected. So, you know, for your responders, do you want to get them on a conference bridge to figure out the situation? For on-call people, do you want to escalate to each of your responders until someone, you know, is available and responds back that they can respond to this incident? And also, you can send polling messaging asking if they're available, if they're busy with another issue, or even for your students or faculty who might be impacted, you can send out messages. Are you safe? Are you able to get to safety? Do you need assistance? So with our automated communication, just to give you guys a closer but high-level overview. With our incident communication and management solution, you can set up predefined templates that will automate the majority of this, which are easy to select on the fly when stress levels are heightened. They're easy to fill out, and there's communication automation behind the scenes. So what we just discussed, what the message is, who's going to be targeted, you could have it map-based, and how it's going to be delivered, meaning through what channels. So to just take a quick look into where things can be sent. Many campuses have, or many universities and colleges have campuses that are spread out through a city, or have multiple buildings, and maybe only one specific area needs to be targeted with a specific message. So you can do that within the Everbridge solution, and also target a specific building or radius around a building. Next, you are allowed. One of the things that we have that's great is to emphasize protecting students and employees is you can set up security badge access controls, have Everbridge connectors with Nexus network access as well, so you know who's in the building, what floor, and determine what type of response is needed. And what this allows you to do is make a more calculated and intelligent approach, an educated approach to your response. One of the other things I want to mention in terms of events, Steve touched upon this, that often these events can coincide with other events, these incidents rather, and say there's a sporting event or a festival on campus, and you have campuses in general have visitors on them quite frequently. And some of the questions we get is, how do we notify those people who aren't in our contact database? Well, with Everbridge, you are able to provide a keyword to students, faculty, and visitors to provide another way for you to communicate with them in an easy way. They would simply text the keyword. I put an example here, university alerts. They could text that to 888-777. So a couple of our partner agencies and universities that are leveraging our solution, they could use it for something like UNH b-ball or UNH sports, and anyone who attends a sports game can get updates on the event that are relevant to it, and also emergency alerts in the case that there is an emergency at one of these events. And that just gives you another option to alert people, whether it's a parent event or students visiting, a sporting event. It just gives you another option in another way to capture that data that you wouldn't normally have in your database. And let me take one step back. So just to give you a quick company overview, won't spend too much time on this. We were founded in 2002. We have offices around the world with data centers in various different countries. We have over 3,000 critical communication customers. And last year, we sent over 1 billion messages. And we've been the market leader for 11 straight years. So this is the last slide I'm going to go over. This is just a quick snapshot. I know we're dealing with some government and higher education customers and users today, but we want to give you a snapshot of our footprint in some of the other verticals in industries such as corporate finance, healthcare, energy, and transportation, just to show you that there are other organizations within your communities that are leveraging Everbridge for some of the similar issues or similar types of scenarios, and using Everbridge in their communication strategy. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to the Q&A session. We have a lot of great questions that have come in, and some that have come in prior as well. So with that being said, let's get started. The first question, as I pull this up, bear with me for 1 second, everyone. So the first question comes from Ruhi in the audience, and it's for you, Steve. When you talk about bystander intervention or fight the shooter, what are your thoughts about permitting firearms on campus as a means of arming staff, faculty, and students to fight the shooter? And there's a second part to that. Is there any research that indicates allowing guns would not help in preventing or minimizing damage of an active shooter incident?
So I'll kind of take the two parts out a little bit out of order. And the answer is there's nothing definitive on either side. If you're talking to people who are of a pro-gun or anti-gun sort of philosophy, they're able to find research, although none of it is fantastic, to support their position, either that it does nothing or it introduces higher risk. But I'll tell you this, I'm going to give you kind of my opinion, and this is what it is, which I think needs to be a little more balanced. I get to work across the country with different organizations, and many of them are schools. And I'll give an example. I was working in kind of northwestern Pennsylvania at a school. It's a place where it's just prevalent with hunters. It's a very different culture around guns. But also it's somewhat off the grid. And there's not a nearby municipal police department. They're covered by state police. And the average response time, depending on where the state police is going to be significant. That's very different than our cities and our suburban areas. So I don't know that there is a good one-size-fits-all. I know people do ask me that, and I sometimes wish I had a better answer, like, you know, the science says this or says that. It's a wishy-washy answer, but I think my best answer is it all depends. It depends on where your school is at, what the culture is like, what your geography is, and local police response times, and a mix of different things about what is probably not just tolerated about guns on campus, but actually what may be sensible and even effective. So that's my best answer, which is a very, very solid, it all depends.
Thank you, Steve. So the next question is from Keith. He wants to know, you know, when a subject is identified as a potential active shooter based on profile motive, how do you prevent an issue from escalating if law enforcement is unwilling to respond based on just student concern of basic threats?
Well, I wish I had a way to kind of clarify the question, but I'm going to kind of assume a few things, and I may get it wrong about the question. I'm thinking if someone is identified by a campus team as being an at-risk student, what we'll call a person of concern, it's not a shooting in progress. It's someone we're worried may escalate to be violent. The best models for this are actually obviously interdisciplinary, and some of the interdisciplinary are on campus, and some will be involving local law enforcement and other partners. Law enforcement make a good standing member on your internal campus sort of threat assessment team, so that you have a little less of these scenarios where they see it one way and you see it the other, because you're trained in a similar model and you're processing cases together, as opposed to we made a decision that this is an at-risk person and then we called the cops. So to have them on the front side as being part of the decision-making process helps reduce the likelihood of that dynamic. That's one. Two is, even if the police don't want to play, if you're using a multidisciplinary team, there may be other options, such as mental health interventions, such as having someone brought in, or the mental health authorities of your area coming to do some sort of on-site evaluation to see if hospitalization is required. There are places, states that have outpatient commitment laws that will force someone to get in and stay in mental health treatment that are effective sometimes at reducing risk of violence. There can be academic actions that are disciplinary. There's a range of different things, but it needs to be a team sport, and by making the assessment of the risk a team sport, then the administration of your countermeasures, the threat management approach, is much more likely to succeed and much more likely to have buy-in. So all I could say is pre-event, the more you can make this a group decision-making process and involve police in the decision-making process about your level of concern about your one person, I think it's going to free up your options to actually then act on your perceived level of risk more effectively and have less of these barriers.
Thank you, Steve. So next question is, It's from Joe in the audience, and I can take this one, Steve. It's regarding the Everbridge system. So the question is, if a person who is supposed to send a message isn't at their desk or doesn't have their laptop with them, is it possible to send an alert with Everbridge via their mobile phone or an iPad? So the short answer is yes. We do have an app called ManageBridge, which you'd be able to do that, and you would even be able to activate your incident templates from that, so that way, whether you were unfortunately, in the unfortunate circumstance of being in the building, that the incident's happening and you can't reach your desk or your computer, you'd be able to do that. Or also, if it happens, most of these events, as you guys know, don't always happen during business hours. So if you're at home and you need to activate incident scenario, you would be able to do that. So the next question is from Kane in the audience. And Steve, he wants to know, in your opinion, should all secure facilities have an on-site tactical response team?
Repeat the question to me again, Michael. Should all?
Sure. So the question was, should all secure facilities have an on-site tactical response team?
Secure facilities?
Correct.
Again, that can mean different things to different people. I'm guessing it depends on the nature of the facility and the nature of the people or the perceived risk. The place I always run into problems, Michael, and for the whole group is kind of the, should we always? So much goes into that mix. I mean, the cost of having the TAC team, the level of training and such to have an on-site TAC team, depending on your level of risk, it may be totally justified, and it may be, and I do actually have clients who have full-time, always standing by TAC teams in their facilities. But they're very rarefied sort of environment, and it makes good sense there. So I think the decision on that really can't be from, or even much advice from an outsider like me. I think there are cases where it makes a lot of sense and it's justified, and I think there may be some cases where it's overkill, and there's not good justification for it. But it comes back to the risk assessment and what comes out of that. So the facility, the nature of the folks coming through it, what it represents, its location. There's probably a good dozen or more factors that would go into the risk equation. An on-site TAC team, it may be very smart and very sound if the risk indicators are there to support that. So I couldn't say with an absolute. It's another one of those, it all depends, but there may be good cause for it, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. So we have a lot of questions that are coming in, and unfortunately, we actually have gone about 10 minutes over. So I'm going to take one more question for each, myself and Steve. So I'll take the Everbridge question first, which is from Alex, and he wants to know, which I actually addressed this question, so maybe Alex, you missed this part. Can Everbridge alert visitors who wouldn't be, in the normal emergency contact database? The answer is yes. You can do so, either with our community engagement or Nixle solution, where you can use event keywords or just a keyword for your university, a general one, where you give the option to students, faculty, visitors, even neighboring residents within your campus community, your greater campus community. You can provide a keyword like university alert, something along that nature, where they could opt in and receive text alerts for your campus, which would include or can include emergency alerts. The last question, Steve, and I'd like to thank everyone for all these great questions. So the last one from Derek is, in the heat of an event, how do you differentiate between an active shooter event and a shooting event?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is you can't always tell in the very beginning. The nature of an active shooter, if you look at the cases, they usually begin very quickly because the shooter knows that the clock is running. He, and these are 96% male, understands that as soon as the first shot's fired, law enforcement's notified, they're on their way. The response time nationally is somewhere between, I think, 3 and 7 minutes or 3 to 5 minutes, so it's going to be quick. If they are hell-bent on an active shooter situation, there's going to be a barrage. The person is going they're going hard, they're going big, and it's not very contained. They're going to be on the move. Shooting incidents tend to be targeted towards someone they know. It tends to be targeted towards, they're not random victim selection. Most active shooter scenarios are random victim selection. They tend to be contained. The shooter tends to either shoot 1 or 2 people and try to leave, and that kind of eliminates the threat. In a number of these cases, of course, does the same and will commit suicide. We've had cases of them evolving into a standoff or hostage case, but there's not a lot more people shot. So unfortunately, in the very, very beginning, you're not going to know that, and it honestly doesn't matter in the very beginning, because our first move has to be life safety. It has to be get out of the line of fire, get other people out of the line of fire, and start our initial movements. It won't be until the clock winds down and the next few seconds and the next few moments unfurl that we actually know. So you sadly have to treat almost every shot fired at the beginning as having the potential to be an active shooter until you know otherwise. So I guess the way to finish the answer is you'll know otherwise pretty quickly. From what we know about how active shooter events unfold as compared to shooting incidents, you're going to know pretty quickly what you got. The problem is you're going to have to treat a shot fired as a shot fired either way until the clock plays out a little bit further and you can see how it goes.
Awesome. Steve, thank you again for the great presentation, a lot of positive feedback. So, on behalf of myself and, obviously from the feedback we got from the audience, thank you once again for a great presentation. And thank you to our participants who joined us today and stuck on a little longer. Thank you, Steve, for staying on a little longer as well. As a reminder, for those of you who'd like to access the slides and the recording, we will be putting that together today, and hopefully it'll be sent out. You'll be receiving it in the next couple of days. If you shouldn't receive it, or for some reason don't receive it, feel free to go to our website and go to our resources tab, and it should be under webinars, webinar replays. With that being said, this is the conclusion of the webinar. Everyone have a great day and look forward to seeing you all again online soon. Goodbye.